Добрый вечер. Я рада участвовать в фестивале «Вещь» и хочу поблагодарить Алену Сокольникову, которая меня пригласила рассказать о моей книге, изданной в 2005 году. «Представь, что нет собственности. Социалистические вещи русского конструктивизма». Я начну с чтения с первой страницы. Эпиграф из Джона Леннона из песни «Представь себе», 1971 год. Представь, что нет собственности. Интересно, у тебя получится? Свет с востока. Не только освобождение трудящихся. Так пишет русский конструктивист Александр Родченко в письме домой весной 1925 года. Свет с востока в новом отношении к человеку, к женщине и к вещам. Наши вещи в наших руках должны быть тоже равными, тоже товарищами. Они этими черными и мрачными рабами, как здесь. In these evocative lines, Rodchenko names a new kind of emotionally affective object, the comradely object of socialist modernity. Unlike the commodities he encounters on his visit to capitalist Paris, which elicit a possessive relation that makes the objects into slaves, things made in the socialist East will actively promote egalitarian socialist culture. They will replace the pleasure of commodity possession, not with its presumed communist opposite of material renunciation, but with something far more peculiar and psychologically powerful, the material object as an active, almost animate participant in social life. This book investigates this concept of the socialist object as Russian constructivism's original contribution not only to the history of the political avant-garde art movements of the 20th century, but also to the theory of a non-capitalist form of modernity. The socialist object addresses a fundamental problem in Marxist thought. What happens to the individual fantasies and desires organized under capitalism by the commodity fetish and the market after the revolution? Capitalism, in its honing of the commodity form that endlessly organizes and gives form to these desires, has a profound weapon that socialism cannot simply cede to it. The constructivist counterproposal to this weapon is the object as comrade. Object as comrade, вещь как товарищ или товарищеская вещь. Как я пришла к идее о товарищеской вещи? I started the project that became this book with an interest in productivism. In the first issue of Lev, in 1923, the constructivist theorist Осип Брик from the Institute of Artistic Culture, Институт художественной культуры, Инхух, wrote a text with the title «The производство». Первые строки статьи. Родченко был беспредметником, стал конструктивистом и производственником. Не на словах, а на деле. Родченко знает, что, сидя у себя в мастерской, ничего не сделаешь, что надо идти в реальную работу, нести свой организаторский дар туда, где он нужен, в производство. This was interesting to me because the more work I did, research on my project, the more I began to realize that the productivists did not really focus on production, but instead on consumption. They ended up making new kinds of things for use in everyday life, things that would transform consumption under socialism as much as production. These are the things that I'm calling the comradely object, the товарищеская вещь. When I first started conducting research in St. Petersburg and Moscow, I was specifically interested in the Soviet campaign in the 1920s to promote the новый быт. And I was thinking about how the productivists wanted to make new things for the новый быт. And in my first chapter of the book, Everyday Objects, бытовые вещи, I write specifically about Vladimir Tatlin, and his new things that he invented, like you can see in this image, his wood-burning stove and his warm winter coat that he wrote about in an article for Krasnaya Panorama under the title Новый быт. And I'm also showing you one of the posters that I started to be interested in promoting the Новый быт, 10 октября, from 1923. So I began with this interest in the новый быт and thinking about the relationship of constructivism and the new constructivist object to the новый быт. But the more I was reading contemporary writing from the time, I started to understand the significance of the idea of the вещь in early Soviet theory, both in the theory of art and in the theory of the новый быт. And so my focus shifted from the новый быт to the problem of the вещь, although, of course, also the вещь in the новый быт. And the productivist theorist Boris Arbatov became very important for me. He's most famous for his book «Искусство и производство», which has recently finally been translated into English. But I was most struck by his article «Быт и культура вещи» по постановке вопроса that he published in 1925 in the Almanach Пролеткульта. And in this article, he attempted to imagine how socialism would transform what he thought of as passive capitalist commodities into active socialist things. And he called for, as you can see here, вещь как дополнение физиологически трудовых приспособлений организма, как социально-трудовая величина, как орудие и как сотрудник. And these new socialist things would then produce new experiences of everyday life, of быт, new relations of consumption, and new human subjects of modernity. So in addition to Rodchenko's term товарищ, Arbatov adds орудие and сотрудник as names for these things. And so the question is then, как можно смотреть на конструктивистские вещи как товарищи или как сотрудники? Что это вообще значит? One of my chapters where I talk about this notion of the comradely object, the товарищеская вещь, is called the constructivist flapper dress, which would be translated as something like конструктивистское модное платье, like you see here in this window design by constructivist Lyubov Popova from 1924. So this was a design she made to go in the window of a store where she was imagining showing her design for a dress together with these terms for the season, the summer fashion season from 1924, Leta 1924, along with this car as a sign of the modern next to her dress design. So she worked in both in fashion design and in textile design. So I'm interested in the relation between her designs for fashionable dresses, which were not previously really considered to be truly constructivist, and then in relation to her geometric fabric designs, which were always considered to be true productivist objects that were mass-produced at the Moscow textile factory called the Первая ситценабывная, where she and Stepanova worked in 1923 and 1924. So she designed these fabrics that were mass-produced at the factory in true productivist style. And so they are always seen as constructivist objects, but her dresses were not. And I was interested in that as a problem. So I'm showing you one of her fabric designs here, and then also the way that it was reproduced on the cover of the Journal Lev, number 2 in 1924, in a design by Rodchenko. And this issue of Lev was dedicated to her after her premature death at the age of 35 in 1924. Textile design had traditionally been seen as a feminine practice associated with applied and decorative art. But the constructivists challenged those hierarchies and embraced Popova's fabric designs as examples of technological mass production. So there was no feminine or applied art stigma attached to her fabric designs. They were seen as absolutely central to what the constructivists wanted to do. The Lev editors wrote in this issue of the journal dedicated to her, Попова была конструктивистской производственницей не на словах только, а на деле. Когда ее вместе со Степановой пригласили работать на фабрике бывший Циндель, то не было счастливее ее человека. Дни и ночи просиживала она над рисунками для ситца. So in this editorial, they praise Popova's work at the factory, and they also talk about the way that her fabric designs met the demands of economics. They appealed to consumer taste, and they battled against what they called the conservatism of commercial culture at that time, Russian commercial culture at that time. So this was the moment of the Novaya Ekonomicheskaya Politika, NEP, which was started in 1921, which legalized private trade and private manufacture in order to help the Soviet economy. So it was this mixed economy of both state and private organizations. And I have been interested in my project and always in my research in mass culture, in material culture, the kind of material culture that the constructivists interacted with. And I'm showing you here these menus that were made around 1923 in Leningrad, which I think you can see can illustrate for us this so-called conservatism of the commercial visual culture of NEP, and especially the clothing. You can see that the men and women here are wearing very traditional bourgeois type clothing, nothing like the kinds of fabric designs and clothing designs that the constructivists were interested in. And you can also see in these clothing advertisements from exactly this moment, the kind of traditional fashion that was being sold during in this period of NEP, that Popova and Stepanova were making their work deliberately kind of responding to this, proposing a different kind of constructivist socialist clothing in response to NEP. And I've always been interested in the contrast between Stepanova and Popova in their designs. So Stepanova is known for her sports clothes, and they have always seemed to me to be a kind of outright refusal of fashion. She's saying, no, we're not going to have fashion. I'm going to make these extremely androgynous, linear clothes that don't actually show the body, but that really become these geometric designs. They anticipate some kind of socialist future of class and sexual egalitarianism. Whereas Popova's designs for dresses seem to take a very different approach. It's as if she wants to meet fashion and reinvent fashion, thinking of fashion as a kind of comrade for Soviet women as they begin to transition from capitalist fashion towards a new socialist byt, and they will need clothes to wear that will carry with them all the excitement and desire of fashion, but then begin to move that fashion in some kind of new socialist direction. And these two photographs of Stepanova and Popova have always seemed to me to really embody the differences that I'm trying to kind of sketch here between them, where Stepanova in this famous portrait by Rodchenko is working with mechanical forms of drawing, working intensely, chewing on her cigarette, wanting to make new technologically assisted designs. Whereas this earlier photograph of Popova, she's wearing this really beautiful blouse with this fur trim and just seems to have a more personal interest in fashion. So if we compare Popova's dress designs to contemporary fashion magazines, such as the Journal для Хозяек, I'm showing you here some of their pattern designs that they published from 1925. So this was a magazine that combined interest in fashion and dress patterns with very serious socialist articles about the Nový byt, about the new rights of women under socialism, and so on. If we compare Popova's dress design, I think we can see the way that the fashionable aspects of her dress come not from expensive fabrics or complex tailoring like the designs in the magazine, but really come from the graphics, the bold graphics of her fabric design. And so she recreates the stylish effects of the dresses in the magazine in a very simple way. So the dress gets its shape through the big belt that she's just tied around the waist, rather than through the more complicated tailoring of the dresses in the fashion magazine. And also the collar is attached to the dress in a very crude, simple way. It's kind of bunched on there. So the dress is slightly clumsy, we might say. It's not as elegant as the real fashion dresses, but it is also ready for mass production. It would be very easy to assemble because the parts are very simple. So we could say that Popova's fashionable dress designs acknowledge that addressing feminine consumer fantasy is a necessary component of the socialist object, of the товарищеская вещь, even if the constructivist goal is to direct that fantasy away from decoration and ornament and toward this idea of the целесообразные вещи that would be ready for production. One of the reasons that Popova had the opportunity as a woman artist to make such a central contribution to constructivism was that constructivism rejected the traditional hierarchies of art to work within the traditionally feminine areas of byt. So Russian constructivism is unusual for the very strong role played by women in it, certainly compared to other artistic movements in Europe at that time. And one of the arguments of my book is that, in a way, all of the constructivists were interested in working in byt, and not only in these more masculine areas of kind of тяжелая промышленность, but also just working в быту. And so one example of this would be Rodchenko, where there's this very well-known photograph of him from 1922, where he's dressed in his prazodежда that he designed. And he appears standing here poised to fulfill the productivist program of working in the factory. It seems to be a photograph that says the производство, like Brick said. But he never did. Instead of working in the factory, this dream of тяжелая промышленности appeared instead as illustrations of industrial machines on objects of everyday consumption, such as his design for a mass-produced box for the Naša industrija karameli from the state-owned factory Krasny Oktябрь. This is my recreation of what the box would have looked like when it was folded up. And so I've just always been interested in the way that there are these little pictures of machines that go along with the name of the caramels, Nasha Industria, and they seem to stand in for the actual heavy industry and производство that the productivists said that they wanted to be part of. And this caramel box forms part of another chapter of the book, which is called Constructivist Advertising and Bolshevik Business, Конструктивистская реклама и большевистский бизнес, or business. And that is a chapter about the advertisements and commercial graphics that he made together with Mayakovsky in their business called Reklamkonstruktor. And specifically, I will talk for a moment now about the advertising poster that forms the cover of my book, and that is the central image for me in the book. And then is their advertising for Krasny Oktyabr печенье. And in this poster, he combines some of his constructivist geometric work. So I'm showing you here his пространственные конструкции from the Abmochu exhibition in 1921. And you can see here hanging from the ceiling his various конструкции, this one in the form of an ellipse, this one in a circle, and this one with the red arrow is in the form of a hexagon. And so you can see the way that he really takes these forms from his earlier constructivist experimental work and uses it then in this advertisement as a kind of frame around the central image of the girl. And he also, of course, uses these straight lines and sans serif typography, also standard for constructivism. It's modernist graphics. But then he combines them with this really funny image of this little girl with this row of cookies just kind of marching into her mouth. And I read this, as a central image in my book for the argument about how the товарищеская вещь was meant to transform the person who used the вещь, who interacted with the вещь. As Arbatov said, that the person for whom the вещь was a сотрудник, when they worked together, they would both be transformed. And so here it's as if the transformation of the user, the потребитель of the вещь, is transformed literally through actual literal consumption. She's actually eating the cookies. They're entering her body. So it becomes this sign for the transformation of the subject by the new socialist object, because the cookies are, of course, also socialist objects because they're made by Krasny Oktyabr, not by Enyem, as Mayakovsky's slogan points out, but Enyem has been replaced, the capitalist commodity has been replaced by the socialist object. So this little girl becomes this sign almost of this kind of conscious consumer because she's looking directly out at us and she's kind of actively biting on these cookies, consciously ingesting them. So Mayakovsky's rhyme speaks in the voice of the girl herself. Я ем печенье фабрики Красный Октябрь, бывший Эйнем. And I think that both Rodchenko and Mayakovsky were probably looking at an ad like this, an advertisement from the pre-revolutionary period for печенье Эйнем, because just like this advertising where she says «Мой первый шаг за печеньем Эйнем», it's her own voice, the little girl's voice, just like it is in Mayakovsky's slogan for Krasny Oktyabr. So you get the sense that they're referring to this advertisement. And I think that they are deliberately invoking the past of Enyem. So to invoke the past desires of consumption and to take these desires, and in this case, they're very sort of sentimental ones, this sentimental image of the little girl who's so cute with her chubby legs skipping across the Moscow River to the Aenium factory. They're invoking these desires and these sentimental memories precisely in order to harness them and transform them for the Novy Byt, for Krasny Oktyabr, for socialist consumption. And so I think that the little girl in the Krasny Oktyabr poster challenges the sentimental image of the pre-revolutionary girl. Rodchenko specifically has made this girl quite strange because he's added in these plucked penciled eyebrows and red lipstick, making her sit somewhere between the image of a wholesome little communist girl and a sexy modern woman who would be more associated with Western models of advertising, or even of the previous year at Krasny Oktyabr, where they still had commercial graphics that looked like this, with this very kind of dreamy, sentimental, beautiful woman advertising Krasny Oktyabr. So they're refusing this sentimentality of both the baby girl of the pre-revolutionary advertisement and the dreamy adult woman through this strange figure of the young girl with her biting mouth who invites the viewer to consume these new socialist objects, the Red October cookies, and reject precisely the bывший mir of бывший Aenium in favor of the new world of the Novy Byt. And for me, throughout the book, it's always important to be thinking about how these objects, these advertisements, these designs interacted with the public, were present in public space. And so for me, the idea of Popova having a window design, the idea that this image would have been in a window seen by the public, even though we don't have an actual documentary photograph showing that. And then this photograph of the Krasny Oktyabr cookie ads on a kiosk in the center of Moscow. So that is just a kind of a brief introduction to some of the ideas in the book, and the idea of the товарищеская вещь. And the book has had, well, it was published a long time ago in 2005, and so it has had a chance to become quite well known. It has had a life not just for scholars of the Russian avant-garde, but in all kinds of broad fields that people have been interested in it, in modernist studies, in people who study material culture, people who work on the theory of the thing, people who are interested in feminist approaches to design, people who are interested in fashion because of my chapter on Popova and Stepanova. And I've been especially glad to see the way that the book seems to have been read a lot in art schools and design schools. I've been invited several times to speak at art schools and have interacted with students who seem to have found in the book, even though it's a very scholarly book with a lot of footnotes and a lot of archival research that's trying to make a very specific argument about Russian constructivism, it also seems to have touched a broader chord for people just thinking about design and objects and possible revolutionary objects and how to change the world through design. So I'm especially glad to be invited to talk about the book today in this context of Bang Bang Education and this new design initiative in Moscow. There, I guess most recently, I thought I would share with you that there was a recent exhibition that just closed a week ago at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was an exhibition called Engineer, Agitator, Constructor, The Artist Reinvented. And it was an exhibition about artists, like the constructivists in Russia, who wanted to be engineers and agitators and constructors and not traditional artists. And so it includes material from Western Europe, but it also includes a lot of Russian material. And you can see here on the website for MoMA that one of their web components was this project called Shopping Phantasmagoria, where the poet Katie Ferris was writing about Rodchenko and Mayakovsky's advertisements and thinking about them precisely in terms of shopping and sort of a consumption, consumer culture, fantasy, and desire. So it was exciting to see some of the ideas of the book reaching this much broader public. And I would just briefly say, I would like to talk a little bit about the work that I've done more recently upon completing this project, which stayed very focused on the most famous Russian avant-garde artists, the constructivists, in which there was great interest always in Western Europe and the United States. People have always been interested in the constructivists. I went on to become interested in what happened after constructivism in Soviet art, and also what happened at the same time as constructivism, looking at the kinds of visual production that have not become as famous in Europe and in the United States. So I'll share with you one example of my work was an exhibition that I curated in 2017 for the 100th anniversary of the revolution. And it was called Revolution Every Day, Революция каждый день. And it was an exhibition. I'm showing you the catalogs here. The catalogs had 4 different covers. They're all posters that show images of women. And this exhibition, which I curated with my husband, Robert Bird, and the artist Zach Cahill, was about the idea of the lived experience of revolution. So the idea that the revolution is an explosion, a kind of disruption in life. But then after the revolution, how do people learn to actually live revolution every day? So it was a play. The title was a play on words. The everyday in English is one word. It's an adjective, but we split it apart to say revolution every day, day after day. How do we live it? And so the exhibition incorporated a lot of posters from the 1920s and 30s, many of them by women artists who had been associated with constructivism, like Valentina Kulagina, but then also artists who were associated with Akr, with the more realistic artists who would eventually become who would eventually lead the way to socialism. So, for example, the artist Maria Bribein, who's not very well known, but who made realistic images. So this cover shows a detail of a poster by Maria Bribein. In this exhibition, it was interested in everyday life, in byt, and therefore specifically in women's experiences, women experiencing everyday life. We also showed films like by Dziga Vertov. Behind us in this photograph of the curators is a still from his film Tri Героиня, about female aviators. So in any event, this project was a way for me to continue some of the ideas from the book, but looking at different kinds of materials and sort of pushing the questions in a different direction, and specifically thinking about the 1930s and Stalinism and imagining how that could be, how one could think about a revolutionary narrative in relation to the 1930s. And finally, I just want to tell you briefly about my current project. I've just completed a book on Alexander Deineke. It is being delivered to the press now, but in the United States, books take a very long time, so it won't be out until 2022. It's called «Коллективное тело Александра Дейнека на пределе соцреализма». And I think about him, again, very much in relation to the themes of my work from Imagine No Possessions. So thinking about him in 1925, he was not working for Lev, because Lev was for the constructivists and for the Levые художники. And he was instead illustrating journals like Bezbožnik u stanka. He worked for them for many years, making all kinds of fantastic images. And you can see here, he's working with some of the same ideas as the constructivists. So here, this image of, which one of these women is the Bezbožnica? Obviously, it's the woman on the right in her red shirt and her simple dress, and not the woman on the left who's wearing this fashionable dress that is purely fashionable and not in any way being directed in a different direction towards socialism like Popova's dresses. And we can see that the woman in the green dress, she has her fashionable hat and purse. She's carrying some packages because she's just been shopping. And she has this house with curtains and lampshades. So it's clearly kind of Mishansky Beats. Whereas the other woman is coming from the factory dressed in these simple clothes, sort of mass-produced clothes. And so I see Deineke, I study the way that he interacted at Vchutemas with the constructivists. He actually interacted quite closely with Mayakovsky, and yet he was on a very different path. And I'm showing you here his painting from 1937, Na ženskom sabranии. This is a painting that lives in Chelyabinsk, so it's not very well known. It finally was seen last winter at the Deineke Samokhalov exhibition in St. Petersburg. And even here, one can see the way that ideas about objects and things that describe people, who are these women in 1937, these kinds of maybe общественницы, sort of well-dressed women, perhaps they're wives of Soviet managers, but you can see that they have all their beautiful clothing in all these different colors. But then you also see in amongst them the kind of the working woman in her very different clothing. And in my essay for the Deineke Samochvalov catalog, I called it Deineke Feminist, making an argument for a certain kind of feminism in Deineke's work, which for me is very much part of this longer trajectory of my project in looking at Soviet visual culture from constructivism and the Новый быт and the товарищеская вещь, and now into considering a very different artist who is obviously in the 1930s becomes a very favored artist under the system of socialist realism. So it's a quite different story, but it contains many of the same themes. So that is the end of what I wanted to say today. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions. До свидания.